Hi there, thanks for joining. Contrasts play a big role in painting. First off, when you make mistakes in contrasts, then your painting can look flat and unrealistic. And secondly, contrasts play a big role in composition. So it's just fun, and let's start very simple. The difference between the color of this paint and my palette is small, so this is a low contrast. I've put the same paint on this paper. And then you see, because the paper is white, the contrast, it's the same paint, the same gray as on my palette, but see how dark it looks on white. That's because the contrast between this gray color and the white is big. If I add this gray paint on the paper, see? This gray contrasts less with the white paper already because it is lighter and it gets closer to the value of the paper. In art we say the colors and all things we see have a tonal value, a value from light to dark. More on that later in this video. The paper is the lightest value that you can get, white, but this gray value is closer to the value of the paper than this gray value. Now, of course, on a white paper, what could be the biggest contrasting color that you can add? Black. We all know that, I guess. You see, that's the biggest contrast that you can imagine, black and white. Now, as you can see on the palette, some colors are rather light by itself. So yellow, for instance, is a rather light color. Purple is a rather dark color. And orange is a little bit somewhere in between, and this green is also has a little bit somewhere in between. So if you look at the color wheel, you see all the colors in their main form, their most optimal form, and you see that there are a lot of differences in how light or dark that they are. So if I put yellow on the paper next to the black, these two are very contrasting because black is very dark and yellow is very light. And look at this. If I put this gray mixture next to the yellow, then again, this is a lower contrast because this gray is almost as light as that yellow. And so I could make it even lighter. And then you see, it starts contrasting even less. See? To understand contrasts completely, we need a little bit of a recap on color theory, because colors have three main components. You have the color family itself, so what kind of color do you call it? Is it obviously a red, a yellow, a blue, etc.? So the main colors that you see on the color wheel, the color family I call them. The second component is the tonal value. I shortly explained that already. Black has a dark tonal value. This gray is a very light tonal value, but a color also has tonal value. So the yellow is a light tonal value, and this is a little bit more in between. And then the third component of color is the saturation. How vivid is the color? So you could say this yellow is very vivid. It is yellow in its most optimal form, I would say. The grays obviously aren't vivid at all. They are grey. They're rather neutral. Black as well and white. But let's take a look at that yellow, for instance. If I add grey to yellow, then you see this is a very desaturated yellow. Now, a color can be desaturated more or less. You see, if I add a slightly more yellow again to the mixture, then it becomes more yellow, more saturated as we call it. So I can balance the saturation of colors. But the main thing is that you understand that the color consists of three things: the hue, the value, and the saturation. And these three things always work together. So you can say, I mean, the yellow has a kind of tonal value, it has a kind of a saturation, and it is a color family. And if I adjust the yellow by adding gray, then it's possible that I also adjust the tonal value and the saturation. Now, I put some black on my canvas here, like this. You see that this is very dynamic. It is this, when you focus in on this part, it is dramatic, you could say. But if I put a very dark gray color inside this, then it looks very soft and it looks kind of harmonious. Same goes if I add slightly dark gray around this again. You see, it still looks rather harmonious and soft because the tonal values are close. But as soon as I do a white dot like this, boom, then I have a high contrasting image. And this is more dynamic. Now let's look at yellow and purple. I'll put some yellow over here. Now I grab some purple and look what happens. I'll put some purple around it as well. Here we have very hard contrasts. And why is that in this case? First off, there's a contrast between the tonal values. The yellow is very light, purple is very dark. So that's the same story as with black and white. Or something similar. But another thing is, and that's very important to realize, purple and yellow, when you look at the color wheel, then you see that yellow and purple are far apart from each other. They don't lie close together on the color wheel. When you put colors next to each other that lie far apart on the color wheel, then you get big contrasts. And if you put colors next to each other that lie closer to each other, then you get smaller contrasts. So I'll show you that now straight away. First I have to clean my brush. So here we go, same purple color. And this time my painting style changes because now I'm more in the circle period. See? That's my artistic development. I started off with squares and now already I'm heading over to circles. Okay, now I'm gonna add yellow in between. Oops, mistake. Of course, we already know what yellow does. So, I'm so sorry. I want to add a low contrasting color, blue. And this blue color is a little bit transparent, but that's no problem, you still get the idea. Do you see that this is a softer looking image than this? And that's because the color contrast is smaller, so the colors are closer to each other on the color wheel, and then you get a smaller contrast as well. And the same would be true, for instance, if I painted yellow over here. I just do a small one like this, and I did a little bit of green. And then you see that this as well is a softer looking image, less dramatic than this, because these colors lie close to each other on the color wheel. And now I've gone to the left side, so to speak, on the color wheel, so I went to green, but you could also go to the orange side, of course. Orange is also close to yellow, and that would have been a softer color contrast as well. But now let's look at another fun thing. We saw that the contrast here is big because the contrast in tonal value is very big. Purple is dark, yellow is light. Also, the colors are very different color families. They lie far apart from each other on the color wheel. But there's more. These two colors are in their most optimal saturated form. So this is a very vivid purple and this is a very vivid yellow. I can bring the contrast down by making the colors duller, less saturated, because whenever colors are less saturated, they start contrasting less. Now there are a lot of ways to desaturate colors. You can add white. See, the white makes the yellow less saturated. It also makes it lighter in this case, of course. Another way to desaturate colors. And then of course I get a lot of comments straight away. You cannot use black, that's not allowed, etc. And you can use complementary colors. And that's true, and I'll show that shortly. In this yellow I've added black, of course. That changes the tonal value of the yellow. And then you see It gets darker, but it also gets less saturated, as we call it, less vivid. Another way to desaturate the color, but I've made a complete video about that, so I'll put a link in the description, but this is a very short explanation. A third way to tone down a color is by making it gray, and you can do that, for instance, by adding a little bit of the complementary color. The complementary color is the color that is opposite of the color on the color wheel. So for instance, a purple in this case, yellow and purple are opposite of each other on the color wheel. But then always the question is, it is a balancing act, which kind of purple with which kind of yellow. But the short answer, the short way is, let's say I add a bit of purple to this. See, it gets a little kind of brownish, grayish. And when it gets a little bit brown, it must be that the balance of this purple isn't exactly right for this kind of yellow. But again, that's for another video. And of course you can balance it by adding more or less yellow and more or less of the complementary color. Another way of doing this is by literally adding gray. And then again, gray you can make in several ways. You can use gray by mixing black and white, of course. You can make grays your own by mixing blue and brown and other dark colors. There are all kinds of ways, but the idea is when you add gray like this to the color, you desaturate it as well. See, and again you can, for yourself, balance it the way you want. But this, for instance, is a very nice neutral desaturated kind of yellow, you see? So long story short, again, for more information about desaturating colors, watch the video, the link in the description. That's a long story on its own. But I've desaturated the yellow. Now I also desaturate purple as well by adding gray. So here I have a less vivid purple, like this. Okay. I should have made more paint, but let's try. We have that very saturated thing over here. If I put this yellow on top, the desaturated yellow, I hope that I've made enough paint. Oops, you see the purple is still a little bit wet, but that doesn't matter that much because that desaturates my yellow as well, so why it doesn't matter that much. You see, I get a way less vivid yellow. You already see that the contrast between the colors is slightly less. Because one of the two already has given up contrasting a little bit. Now the other one, purple. And I'll make slightly more of that paint because otherwise I don't have enough. So, and now a purple that is desaturated like this. You see? There we go. And even though the tonal value difference between the colors is still rather big, and the color contrast is still there because yellow and purple are still opposite of each other on the color wheel, but now that I've desaturated the colors get closer to each other. And they start contrasting less. And of course you can imagine that if I want an even lower contrast, I can also lower the difference in dark and light, for instance. So I can add more white, and that also lowers the chroma of the color, so it gets less vivid. But also the tonal value gets closer to the yellow. And then you see, so it's a bit messy because I'm painting wet and wet. I should wait till it's dry, but I'm a little bit impatient, of course. I just want to show quickly. But then you see the contrast in color and tonal value and saturation is lower, and then you get less contrast and a softer looking image. And the thing is, you might say, yes, but these look like ugly colors. And that can be true because now we see them surrounded by very vivid colors. But when we isolate this and we look at a gray for a while, and then we put this on top of gray, I do this in the editing program of course, then you see that these colors are still rather colorful, but we get fooled if they are surrounded by more vivid colors. Now for instance, another question, when you have these two more or less contrasting colors, like this purple and this blue, and you want these colors to contrast more, what can you do? First off, you can choose another kind of blue, a blue that's more towards green, for instance. That's a possibility. Here I've used ultramarine blue, and that's a blue that leans a little bit towards purple, so that harmonizes quite good with the purple. If I add a little bit more of a green kind of blue, then the contrast between the colors already gets a little bit bigger because the color shifts more on the color wheel. They're less close. That's one thing. But the other thing that causes these two colors to harmonize a little bit is the tonal value. So if I want to make a contrasting blue here, let's do a little bit extreme. Let me do two things at once. I'll here grab a little bit of, I have this cyan, that's another kind of blue than the ultramarine, because this is more neutral kind of blue. And I also change the tonal value of that blue. So I make it lighter, get baby blue, you see? You see, now I get more, and the paint again underneath is still a little bit wet. Should have waited a bit longer, but you see what happens. There we go. That's a higher contrast because of two things. I shifted a little bit more towards a neutral blue, so further apart from the purple, and also I've added white to make it the tonal value lighter, so more contrast. And if I make it green, you see, then already the contrast gets even more higher. So maybe another small example maybe is funny, because here I have orange. I just put it over here, orange, and then green. Let's put green on the left. Orange and green also are very contrasting. The tonal value differences aren't that big, so how light or dark they are, but they lie rather far apart from each other at the color wheel, so there you have the color contrast again. So again, I want to dull them down. I can make the orange lighter, so when I make a light orange, like this, let's put it over here. There we go. And when I get a light green, like this, and you get these pastel kind of colors. You see? Now they look closer to each other. They don't scream for attention, so it's softer. So that's the whole point. If you, in the painting, you want a certain part to pop out, then you would put these two colors very vividly next to each other. When I don't want to attract the attention too much to those colors, then I'm gonna dull them down. So either by adding white, what I've done now, but you can also add a little bit of gray, of course, to the green and to the orange. That they still contain, here, oh, it's a little bit too dark, so add slightly more white. So this is, now the green is less saturated extra because I've made it more gray. See, it's less saturated than this one. This was already desaturated by the white, but this is even more desaturated because it's leaning towards gray already. Now, and if I go to the orange and I add white and gray, so a little bit of gray, they get even more close to each other. By the way, this is also a trick for if you want to do soft backgrounds. Make colors like this. And also people often ask, how do you make smooth transitions between colors? And the fun thing is, the harder the contrast is, the higher the contrast is, the more difficult it is to make a smooth transition, a blend. And so between black and white, if I put black here and I put white here, of course you don't see it because it's the white paper. Now I want to make a smooth transition, a soft blend. That's rather hard, because the contrast between these two colors is very big. And then it gets difficult for me to control the blend. But if I want to blend black and a gray like this, so that's way more easy, because they're closer. The contrast between the colors is smaller. And that's also why in reality, a lot of the times, when you see very soft blends and you want to paint them like that, often it's the case that the contrasts in one of the three areas, or all three areas, or two of the three areas, is smaller than you would expect. So, but now for instance, I can also add another color to this set, or here. If I want to add a purple color as well, for instance this one, I can dull it down with gray. I can lighten it with a little bit of white. And I can put that around these two colors. And still, there's not much of a contrast going on around here. See? Now, I was, when I was preparing for this video, of course, I start to look for things like contrasts. And then, of course, it's sometimes funny to look at examples. And here you see it's a dull print. My printer didn't work that good. But on this photograph, you see a lot of green. And you see that house that pops out a little bit. So this house is attention grabbing. Also, the waterfall grabs the attention. You immediately get sucked into the photograph to this part. And why is that? We now know, because there's a lot of green in this photograph, and red is a very contrasting color, because it's far apart from green on the color wheel. Therefore, it grabs the attention. So look at this. This could be even more contrasting if it were a very vivid red, you see? You see how that pops out now? Because now there's a contrast in many ways, because there's the color contrast, there's also the saturation contrast, because these greens are rather gray in this photo print. And the third thing, the tonal value, that's less of a contrast, because it isn't much darker or lighter than the surroundings. So, but the waterfall, that grabs a lot of attention because it is very light inside of a dark part. By the way, now that we're at it, that's also why road signs, of course, also are very contrasting. So a road sign like this, of course, it needs to grab your attention, and that's why they use very contrasting colors. And in landscapes, for Patreon I made this tutorial about this landscape painting, and then you see the aerial perspective causes the background to have low contrast, because when you look at the foreground you see very hard contrast between dark and light. Here's a very dark part of the tree and here are more light parts. Very dark shadow on the ground with very light green grass. But in the background you see these trees also have shadow parts, but these shadows are nowhere near as dark as these darks. And the light parts are nowhere near as light as the light parts over here. And that makes that these trees in the background and that hill in the background look soft and far away. Same goes for the meadow over here. That's a low contrasting green compared with this, because the chroma, the saturation of that meadow is very low. It isn't as vivid green as this one. And for Atelier magazine, it's a Dutch magazine on art and painting, etc. But I once made this painting, and I remember it clearly because here I very purposely made the background very soft looking, and I did that by mixing colors that were very similar. They're very light, they're very kind of gray, and they're a desaturated kind of blue, and they all are very close, and that provides for a soft looking background. And I want the main focus on this man with the red kind of raincoat. And to make this, and this is rather saturated kind of color. The color contrasts with the background colors. Also, there's a very big difference in saturation. This is very saturated, this is very desaturated. And also light and dark. You see more contrast in light and dark in this figure than in the background. I will show you another funny example, maybe, I hope you find it funny, is, for instance, once I wanted to paint a red Ferrari, a red sports car, and then you had the asphalt, the tarmac, and surrounding buildings, etc., that were kind of grayish. And then, of course, you have that red of the sports car. Now, of course, red and gray are very contrasting. You see? That's obvious, because that red of the sports car then is rather saturated. But I wanted to exaggerate it a little bit. I wanted to pop that red of the sports car out. So I thought of a trick, and that is to add a little bit of green to the gray of the tarmac. And you can hardly see it. However small that amount of green in the gray, it still makes the red pop out extra. However slight of an adjustment it may be, it still works. Of course, if I add more green, then it will work even more. But that's obvious, and then the tarmac will look strange. But that was a trick that I once used, and I thought that was funny. And that's what you can do with this kind of knowledge, of course. And now, to end the video, I think it's funny. I've got some footage of my palette of last month. It's funny to ask yourself, hey, is he in this moment working on an area with high contrasts, or is he working on an area with low contrasts? And that's fun. You can see it on the palette. That's what I think is funny. So, I hope it was helpful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.